What happens when the galaxy's most feared warrior species discovers that humans don't just fight to win? They fight like the universe itself depends on their victory. Commander Zeth Kara thought he understood warfare until he witnessed humanity's true nature on the battlefield. Some truths can only be learned in blood, and some revelations change everything you thought you knew about power, fear, and the reason why even gods whisper when humans go to war. The first time I saw a human cry, I thought they were broken. Commander Zeth Kara of the Valerian hegemony had witnessed tears before, the desperate weeping of defeated enemies, the bitter sobs of those who had lost everything to war. But this was different. The humans sat alone in the corner of the transport ship's cargo bay, shoulders shaking with silent grief, clutching a small device that projected the holographic image of what I assumed was his offspring. They mourn their dead before the battle even begins. I observed to my second-in-command, Orcs. My 4 arms crossed in confusion as I studied the strange creature. How did such a species ever leave their home world, let alone earn a place in the Galactic Defense Coalition? Orcs' mandibles clicked in agreement. The humans are an anomaly, Commander. Their physical capabilities are unremarkable. No natural armor, no venomous spines, no enhanced strength. Yet somehow, they've become integral to our war effort against the Devourers. I watched the human, Sergeant Marcus Chun, according to his file, as he carefully stored the hollow projector in his chest pocket, directly over his heart. The gesture seemed ritualistic, sacred even. When he looked up, I expected to see the weakness that tears implied among my people. Instead, I found eyes that burned with something I couldn't identify. Something that made my battle-hardened instincts whisper warnings. The transport ship Valor's Edge hummed through hyperspace, carrying our mixed battalion toward the Kepler 442 system. Intelligence reports indicated the Devourers had established a forward base on the system's 3rd planet, threatening to cut off supply lines to 3 coalition strongholds. It was meant to be a standard seek and destroy mission. Eliminate the threat, secure the system, return home with honor. I had served in 17 such missions. This would be my first alongside humans. Attention, all personnel. The ship's communications system crackled to life. We're approaching the Kepler 442 system. ETA to drop zone, 47 minutes. All squad leaders report to the briefing room. I made my way through the ship's corridors, noting how the different species naturally segregated themselves. The Valorians, with our imposing 3-meter frames and natural armor plating, dominated the central areas. The insectoid Zephyrians clustered in the darker corners, their compound eyes gleaming. The amphibian Aquari preferred the humid sections near the water recyclers. And the humans? They were everywhere, moving between groups with an ease that seemed impossible. They spoke broken Valerian to my soldiers, traded jokes with the Zephyrians despite the language barrier, and somehow had convinced 3 Aquari to teach them a traditional war chant. It was unsettling. The briefing room buzzed with conversation in a dozen languages as squad leaders filed in. Colonel Sarah Martinez, the human commander, stood at the holographic display table. She was small even by human standards, barely reaching the chest plate of most Valerian soldiers. Yet every being in the room fell silent when she began to speak. The Devourers have established a processing facility on Kepler 442c. She began, manipulating the hologram to show a detailed surface scan. Current intelligence suggests they're converting captured coalition personnel into biomass for their war machines. Estimated prisoner count, 12,000 souls. 12,000. The number hung in the air like a physical weight. Among the Valorians, such losses would be mourned and avenged, but we understood the mathematics of war. Sometimes sacrifices were necessary for the greater good. But something changed in the humans. I watched their faces carefully, noting the way their jaws tightened, how their hands unconsciously moved to their weapons. The air itself seemed to thicken with an energy I couldn't name. Our mission parameters are simple, Colonel Martinez continued. We insert at dawn, eliminate the processing facility, extract any survivors, and deny the Devourers this strategic position. Intel suggests moderate resistance. Approximately 2,000 Devourer drones, 50 combat forms, and 3 command variants. Lieutenant Urix leaned toward me. Acceptable odds, he whispered. We outnumber them nearly 2 to 1. I nodded, but kept watching the humans. Sergeant Chun had removed that small hollow projector again, staring at the image of his offspring. Other humans were doing similar things, touching photographs, reading letters, whispering what sounded like prayers or promises. It reminded me of pre-battle rituals I'd seen among primitive species, those who hadn't yet learned that emotion was a liability in combat. Questions? Colonel Martinez asked. A Zephyrian commander raised a chitinous arm. What about extraction protocols if we encounter heavy resistance? We don't leave anyone behind, came the immediate response. Not just from the colonel, but from every human in the room, spoken in unison like a sacred creed. I found myself speaking before I could stop myself. Commander Martinez, with respect, tactical doctrine suggests that we don't leave anyone behind, she repeated, her eyes meeting mine with an intensity that made my combat implants trigger warning alerts. Ever. After the briefing, I approached Sergeant Chun in the armory. The humans were preparing their equipment with a methodical precision that impressed me, despite their species' reputation for chaos and unpredictability. Your offspring, I said, gesturing toward his chest pocket, in the image. How old? Chun looked up from his rifle maintenance, surprised by the question. Emma's 7, just started 2nd grade. His voice carried a warmth that seemed impossible in a soldier preparing for battle. You miss her. Every day. He resumed, cleaning his weapon, but I could see his hands tremble slightly. But that's not why I carried her picture. Then why? Chun paused, considering his words carefully. Because she represents everything worth fighting for. Every human child who deserves to grow up free. Every parent who should be able to tuck their kids in at night without fear. He looked at me directly. What about you, Commander? What drives a Valerian to war? The question caught me off guard. In Valerian culture, war was duty. Honor, the natural expression of strength against weakness. We fight because we are strong, and strength must be used to protect those who are weak. That's duty, Chun said, sliding a fresh power cell into his rifle. I asked what drives you. I didn't have an answer. The drop ships launched at dawn, cutting through Kepler 442c's thin atmosphere like knives. Through the viewports, I could see the planet's surface, a wasteland of twisted metal and organic growths where the Devourers had begun their corruption. The processing facility squatted in the center of it all, a nightmarish fusion of technology and biology that pulsed with malevolent life. 60 seconds to drop, the pilot announced. Around me, soldiers made final preparations. The Valorians checked their armor seals and weapon charges with quiet efficiency. The Zephyrians entered their combat trance, compound eyes reflecting internal calculations. The Aquari synchronized their breathing for optimal oxygen intake. The humans prayed. It wasn't the formal, ritualized prayers I'd seen in other species' military traditions. These were personal, whispered conversations with whatever deities or principles they held sacred. Some spoke to gods I'd never heard of, others to deceased family members, and a few simply to the universe itself. Sergeant Chin's lips moved silently, his hand pressed against the image of his daughter. 30 seconds. The dropship's engines shifted pitch as we entered our final approach. Through the tactical display, I could see the other transports in our formation, each carrying its cargo of warriors from across the galaxy. Our species might be different in every way imaginable, but we were united in purpose. Or so I thought. 10 seconds. Lock and load. The bay doors opened with a pneumatic hiss, revealing the hellscape below. The Devourer facility sprawled across several kilometers, its biomechanical structures pulsing with dark energy. Defensive towers tracked our approach, already beginning to charge their weapons. Go, go, go. We dropped into hell. The anti-gravity chutes deployed automatically, slowing our descent just enough to prevent fatal impact. Around me, hundreds of warriors from dozens of species plummeted toward the surface, weapons ready, training taking over. But as we fell, something changed in the humans. I saw it first in their formation patterns. Where other species maintained strict tactical positioning, the humans began to spread out in seemingly chaotic clusters. Their weapons, which had been held in standard ready positions, shifted to configurations I didn't recognize. Then I heard them singing. It started with one voice, a human corporal from Delta Squad, humming a melody I'd never heard. Others joined in, adding harmony, building something that transcended mere music. It wasn't a war chant or battle cry, but something deeper, more primal. The song spoke of loss and love, of sacrifices made and promises kept. It carried the weight of every human who had ever stood against the dark, knowing they might not return home. And somehow, impossibly, it made them stronger. I watched in fascination as the humans' tactical readouts shifted. Heart rates that should have been spiking with combat stress instead showed patterns of focus calm. Neural activity indicated enhanced coordination and reaction times that defied their species' baseline parameters. They weren't just preparing to fight. They were transforming into something else entirely. The ground rushed up to meet us. Devourer defense systems opened fire, filling the air with energy beams and projectile weapons. Several coalition soldiers were hit during descent. A Zephyrian from Gamma Squad disintegrated in a burst of plasma, and a Quarry warrior's chute was shredded by shrapnel. The humans saw their comrades fall, and something terrible happened in their eyes. We hit the ground hard, anti-grav chutes collapsing as we rolled to absorb impact. Around us, the Devourer facility stretched like a living nightmare, its organic components writhing with malevolent intelligence. Defensive drones swarmed from hidden alcoves, their weapons charging with hungry light. Alpha and Beta squads advanced on the primary structure. Colonel Martinez's voice crackled through the comm system. Charlie and Delta secure the perimeter. Echo Squad, with me, we're going after the prisoners. Standard tactics. Efficient deployment. Everything by the book, except for what the humans were doing. I watched Sergeant Chin's squad as they moved toward their assigned objective. They didn't run in the straight lines our training demanded. Instead, they flowed like water around obstacles, each soldier anticipating the other's movements with supernatural precision. When Devourer drones attacked, the humans didn't take cover and return fire according to protocol. They danced. There was no other word for it. Chun rolled beneath a plasma burst, came up firing, his shots synchronized with covering fire from two teammates who had somehow known exactly where he would emerge. Another human, Corporal Rodriguez, vaulted over a piece of debris at the precise moment a drone's targeting system locked onto his previous position, her momentum carrying her into a perfect firing stance. It was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. "Commander!" Lieutenant Urix's voice broke through my fascination. Devourer combat forms, incoming from the north. I turned to see them, the Devourer's heavy assault units, each one a fusion of stolen biological material and corrupted technology. They stood 4 meters tall, armed with weapons that could punch through Valerian battle armor, and they moved with predatory grace that had broken the spirits of 100 coalition worlds. The mixed units of Valorians, Zephyrians, and Aquari took defensive positions according to doctrine. Overlapping fields of fire, mutual support, prepared fallback positions. Everything our military academies had taught us about facing superior individual opponents. The humans charged. Not all of them. Colonel Martinez was too experienced a commander for that. But Sergeant Chin's squad, along with 2 others, broke from the defensive line and ran straight at the approaching combat forms. "What are they doing?" Urix demanded. "That's suicide." I wanted to agree. Every tactical algorithm in my combat computer screamed that the humans were making a fatal error. The Devourer combat forms were stronger, faster, and better armed. Direct assault was madness. But as I watched, I began to understand something that would haunt me for the rest of my days. The humans weren't just attacking. They were proving a point. Chun reached the first combat form while it was still adjusting its targeting systems for multiple fast-moving targets. Instead of attempting to match its strength, he slid between its legs, placing precise shots into joints and sensor clusters. When the creature spun to track him, two other humans were already in position to exploit the opening he'd created. The combat form's death scream echoed across the battlefield, a sound of genuine pain and surprise. The Devourers weren't used to losing their elite units to supposedly inferior opponents. More screams followed. I watched a human medic, a small woman named Patterson, leap onto the back of a combat form twice her size, using nothing but standard-issue explosives and absolute fearlessness to bring it down. She died in the explosion, but not before ensuring that 3 more humans could advance safely. She died singing that same impossible song. Impossible, Orcs whispered. How are they doing this? I didn't answer because I was beginning to understand, and the understanding terrified me. The humans weren't stronger or faster than their opponents. They weren't better armed or armored. But they had something that transcended physical capability, something that our military doctrines had never accounted for. They fought like every battle was personal. Every devourer that fell was vengeance for the prisoners being processed in the facility. Every human who died bought time and space for their comrades with a calculus that prioritized the mission over individual survival. They weren't just soldiers following orders. They were guardians protecting everything they held sacred. And the Devourers, for the first time in my experience, were afraid. I could see it in how their formations began to falter, how their targeting systems seemed less precise when faced with humans who moved like they were dancing with death itself. The creatures that had terrorized 100 worlds suddenly found themselves facing opponents who simply refused to be terrorized. Echo Squad, we've reached the processing facility. Colonel Martinez's voice cut through the chaos. Beginning prisoner extraction now. The facility's main structure loomed ahead of us, a grotesque fusion of metal and flesh that pulsed with dark energy. Somewhere inside, 12,000 Coalition personnel were awaiting rescue or death. The logical part of my mind calculated the odds. Even with our success against the outer defenses, fighting through the facility's interior would cost us at least half our remaining forces. The humans didn't seem concerned with mathematics. Chen's surviving squad members regrouped near the facility's main entrance, their ammunition low, armor scarred, but their eyes still burning with that terrible purpose I'd seen in the transport. Around them, other Coalition forces took defensive positions, preparing for what promised to be a brutal urban assault. Sergeant, I approached Shun during the brief lull. Your casualties are severe. Perhaps you should fall back to the secondary line. He looked at me with those burning eyes, and for a moment I saw past the human exterior to something far more primal. Commander, with respect, those are our people in there. Our comrades. Our family. He gestured toward the facility. The Devourers made this personal when they took them. This is war, I replied, falling back on the cold logic that had carried me through 17 campaigns. Acceptable losses are part of... There are no acceptable losses, Chen interrupted. Not when it comes to family. Before I could respond, the facility's entrance exploded outward in a shower of organic debris. Through the smoke came something that made my combat instinct scream warnings. A Devourer Prime, one of their command variants, easily 6 meters tall, and armed with weapons I'd only seen in intelligence briefings. Around me, Coalition forces raised their weapons and prepared to die fighting. The human smiled. I will carry that image with me until my dying day. A dozen human soldiers, battered and bloodied, ammunition nearly exhausted, facing an opponent that could have single-handedly destroyed a Valerian battlecruiser. And they smiled like they'd been waiting their entire lives for this moment. The Prime raised its weapons, energy building to levels that would vaporize anything in a 50-meter radius. The humans began to sing again. This time, I understood the song. It wasn't about victory or glory or any of the things we tell ourselves justify warfare. It was about love, love for fallen comrades, love for those still trapped inside, love for children who deserve to grow up free, love for a universe worth preserving. It was about refusing to let darkness win. The Prime fired, and the humans danced through hell itself to reach it. The energy blast that should have killed them all struck empty air. I watched in disbelief as 12 humans moved like they shared a single mind, each one anticipating the Prime's targeting patterns with impossible precision. Sergeant Shin rolled left as Corporal Rodriguez dove right, their movements creating gaps in the formation that the Prime's weapons couldn't exploit fast enough. But it wasn't just evasion. As they moved, they were setting up something I'd never seen before, a coordinated assault pattern that existed nowhere in Coalition tactical manuals. Now, Chen's voice cut through the chaos. What followed challenged everything I thought I knew about combat. The humans didn't attack the Prime directly. Instead, they attacked the ground beneath it, the walls around it, the very environment that supported its massive frame. Explosive charges placed with surgical precision brought down support beams. Concentrated fire weakened structural joints until the facility's own weight became a weapon. The Prime, for all its terrible power, found itself trapped in a cage of falling debris and collapsing architecture. How did they know? Lieutenant Yerix whispered beside me. How could they predict the structural failure patterns? I had no answer. The humans hadn't had time for detailed reconnaissance. They'd made those calculations in real time, during combat, while dodging weapons that could have erased them from existence. The Prime thrashed against its prison of twisted metal and concrete, its roars of rage echoing across the battlefield. But the humans weren't finished. They moved through the rubble like ghosts, placing charges with the patience of miners and the precision of surgeons. "Fire in the hole," someone shouted. The explosion was carefully controlled, designed not to destroy, but to incapacitate. When the smoke cleared, the Prime lay motionless, its biomechanical systems damaged beyond function, but its core processors intact, perfect for intelligence gathering. Impossible, I breathed. They defeated a Prime without destroying it. Sergeant Sean appeared beside me, his armor scorched and his face streaked with blood from a dozen small cuts. "The prisoner's commander. We need to move fast before the Devourers activate their failsafes." He was right. Devourer facilities were programmed to eliminate evidence, and prisoners if capture seemed imminent. We had minutes at most before 12,000 Coalition personnel would be reduced to biomass to deny us intelligence about their operations. Echo and Delta squads with me. Colonel Martinez's voice crackled over the comm. Alpha and Beta hold the perimeter. We're going in. The facility's interior was a nightmare of biological and technological fusion. Corridors pulsed with organic matter that served as both structure and nervous system. The air itself seemed alive, thick with microscopic organisms that made our environmental sensors scream warnings about toxicity and infection. But it wasn't the alien architecture that stopped me cold. It was what the humans did when they saw it. They became something else entirely. I'd watched them fight with tactical brilliance and coordinated precision outside. Inside the facility, facing the evidence of what the Devourers did to their prisoners, the humans transformed into forces of pure retribution. The first holding chamber we encountered contained 50 Coalition soldiers in various stages of biological conversion. The Devourer process was designed to keep the victims conscious throughout their transformation into raw materials, feeding on their terror and despair as their bodies were systematically harvested. A Valerian warrior might have seen this and felt duty-bound to end their suffering quickly. A Zephyrian would have calculated the most efficient extraction methods. An Aquari would have begun immediate medical triage. The humans saw their people suffering and declared war on the very concept of despair itself. Rodriguez, Thompson, get the medical supplies. Patterson's team, start disconnecting the conversion apparatus. Chun, you're with me. We're finding whoever's running this place. Colonel Martinez moved through the chamber like an avenging angel, her small human frame somehow radiating an authority that made even the dying raise their heads with hope. She knelt beside each prisoner, speaking words I couldn't hear, but whose effects were immediate. Eyes that had been glazed with pain suddenly sharpened with renewed will to live. "How many more chambers?" she asked a partially converted Zephyrian. "Dozens," came the weak reply. "They process 50 at a time. Cycle every 6 hours. 12,000 prisoners. Dozens of chambers." The mathematics were simple and horrifying. We'd need hours to extract everyone, but the facility's automated defenses would be back online in minutes. "We'll need to split up," I told Martinez. "My forces can handle the outer chambers while no." Her refusal was absolute. "We go together, or we don't go at all." "Colonel," with respect, "the tactical situation, Commander." She looked at me with eyes that held depths I couldn't fathom. "You're thinking like a soldier. We need to think like humans." Before I could ask what she meant, Sergeant Chin's voice echoed from deeper in the facility. "Colonel, you need to see this." We found him in what appeared to be a control center, standing before a massive biomechanical display that showed the facility's true purpose. The processing chambers we'd seen were just the beginning. This entire installation was designed to break the spirits of coalition species, to study what made each race fight, and then to weaponize that knowledge. "They're not just harvesting biomass," Chin said, his voice hollow with realization. "They're harvesting hope itself." The display showed detailed psychological profiles of every species in the coalition. How to break a Valorian's sense of honor. How to corrupt a Zephyrian's hive mind unity. How to poison an Aquari's connection to their ancestral waters. And there, in a section marked with particular attention, was everything the Devourers had learned about humans. Fascinating, the display pulsed with artificial intelligence. The human specimens arrive. Perfect timing for the final experiment. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, carried through the facility's organic nervous system. Around us, walls began to shift and flow, sealing exits and creating new passages that led deeper into the nightmare. "You see," the voice continued, "we have studied your species extensively. We understand now why you are so troublesome. It is not strength or intelligence. Many species exceed you in these areas. It is something more fundamental." The air grew thick with pheromones designed to induce despair in human brain chemistry. Environmental controls shifted to create the specific frequency of sound that triggered primal fear responses in human nervous systems. Every system in the facility focused on breaking the humans' will to fight. Instead, I watched them get angry. It wasn't the hot rage of inexperienced warriors or the cold fury of professional soldiers. This was something deeper, a rejection of the very idea that hope could be destroyed, that love could be corrupted, that the human spirit could be broken by anything the universe might throw at it. "You made one mistake," Colonel Martinez said to the artificial intelligence. "You studied us like we were just another species to be cataloged and defeated." "Indeed. And what mistake was that? You forgot that we're the species that looks at impossible odds and says challenge accepted. What happened next defied every principle of military science I'd ever learned. The humans didn't attack the control systems or attempt to disable the facility's defenses. Instead, they began to sing again, that same impossible song that had carried them through the battle outside. But this time it was different. This time, they were singing for the prisoners. The song carried through the facility's organic nervous system, reaching every chamber, every cell, every corner where coalition personnel were trapped in despair. And somehow, impossibly, it began to wake something in them. Not just the will to survive, but the will to fight back. Impossible. The artificial intelligence pulsed with confusion. The psychological conditioning should prevent any coordinated resistance. The subject should be incapable of. Its voice was drowned out by something it had never heard before. 12,000 voices joining the human song, each in their own language, each carrying their own pain and hope and determination. The facility began to shake. "What's happening?" Lieutenant Yerix demanded. I was beginning to understand. "They're not just singing," I whispered. "They're communicating, coordinating. The humans are using the facility's own nervous system to organize a rebellion. It was brilliant and insane in equal measure. The Devourers had designed their facility to monitor and control every prisoner, but they never considered that the same system could be turned against them. The humans were broadcasting hope through the very channels meant to carry despair. And it was working. Throughout the facility, alarms began to sound as prisoners broke free from their restraints. The partially converted used their new biomechanical components as weapons against their captors. Those who could barely move provided intelligence about guard positions and security protocols. 12,000 individual prisoners became a single coordinated force with one shared purpose: escape and revenge. "This is impossible," the artificial intelligence repeated, its voice now tinged with something I'd never heard from a Devourer system before: fear. "The mathematical probability of spontaneous organization among traumatized subjects approaches zero. There must be outside coordination." "There is," Sergeant Chen replied, his hand pressed against his chest pocket where his daughter's image waited. "It's called love, and you can't calculate it, corrupt it, or destroy it, because it's not something you can understand." The facility's biomechanical walls began to pulse with increasing agitation. Emergency protocols activated, flooding the air with toxins designed to pacify the prisoners. Combat drones emerged from hidden alcoves, programmed to restore order through overwhelming force. The humans met them head-on, but this time they weren't alone. Valorians fought beside them, inspired by their example to push beyond standard tactical doctrine. Zephyrians abandoned their calculated approach in favor of the humans' intuitive coordination. Aquari drew strength from the emotional currents flowing through the facility's compromised nervous system. And the prisoners, broken, traumatized, half-converted prisoners who should have been incapable of resistance, fought like heroes from ancient legends. "I don't understand," I found myself saying as we pushed deeper into the facility, following the humans toward what sensors indicated was the primary control center. "How can they do this? How can they turn despair into hope, fear into courage?" Colonel Martinez paused in her advance, looking back at me with an expression of infinite patience. "Commander, what's the worst thing that ever happened to you?" The question caught me off guard. In the middle of combat, facing impossible odds, she wanted to know about my personal trauma. I hesitated, then found myself speaking truth I'd never shared with anyone. "I watched my entire unit die on Zirian Prime. 43 of the finest warriors the hegemony had ever produced killed because I made a tactical error. I was the only survivor. And how did you survive that?" The answer came slowly. "I decided their sacrifice had to mean something. I became a better commander, so it would never happen again." She nodded. "That's what humans do, Commander. We take our worst moments, and we transform them into reasons to fight harder, love deeper, hope more fiercely. Every scar becomes a source of strength. Every loss becomes a promise to protect others from the same fate." Around us, the facility continued to shake as 12,000 voices sang their defiance into the dark. Emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red, and the air grew thick with the screams of dying Devourer drones. "The control center is ahead," Chen reported. "Heavy resistance, but the prisoners are providing cover fire from the vents and maintenance shafts." Indeed, the facility's own design was working against the Devourers. Maintenance tunnels meant for biomechanical repair systems now carried human prisoners turned guerrilla fighters. Air ducts designed to distribute pacifying pheromones now carried messages of hope and coordination. The Devourers had built the perfect prison for breaking spirits. The humans had turned it into the perfect fortress for rebuilding them. "Final assault in 30 seconds, Colonel Martinez announced. "Remember, we're not just fighting for ourselves. We're fighting for every person who ever believed that hope could triumph over despair, that love could overcome hate, that light could push back the darkness." I looked around at the faces surrounding me, humans and aliens alike, all marked by battle, all carrying wounds that would leave permanent scars. But in their eyes, I saw something that transcended species or military doctrine. I saw the reason why gods might fear their fury. Not because they were strong, but because they were unbreakable. Not because they couldn't be hurt, but because they could transform that hurt into a weapon against those who would hurt others. Not because they didn't feel fear, but because they felt it and chose to act anyway. "Move out," Martinez commanded, and we charged into hell itself, following the humans toward whatever waited in the facility's dark heart, knowing that no matter what we found there, these impossible creatures would find a way to transform it into victory. The song of 12,000 voices carried us forward, and for the first time in my 17 campaigns, I understood what it truly meant to fight for something worth dying for. The control center was a cathedral of nightmares. The chamber stretched upward into darkness, its walls lined with thousands of biomechanical pods, each one containing a prisoner in various stages of conversion. But these weren't random captives. As we drew closer, I realized with growing horror that these were the command staff from every coalition world the Devourers had conquered. Admirals, generals, planetary governors, research directors. The finest minds and strongest leaders from 100 species, all connected to a vast organic network that pulsed with malevolent intelligence. "They're not just processing them," Dr. Sarah Kim, the human xenobiologist attached to our unit, whispered in horrified fascination. "They're networking their minds, creating a collective intelligence from the best strategic minds in the coalition." At the center of it all stood something that defied description, a massive biomechanical construct that seemed part computer, part living organism, and part something else entirely. It pulsed with dark energy, and when it spoke, I recognized the voice that had taunted us earlier. "Welcome," it said, and I could hear the echoes of 1,000 conquered commanders in its tone. "You arrived just in time to witness the final experiment, the ultimate test of the human spirit." The construct shifted, and I saw what it meant. In the pods closest to its core were humans, dozens of them, including officers I recognized from previous campaigns. But these weren't random prisoners. These were the humans the Devourers had captured specifically to study, to break, to understand. And in the center pod, connected directly to the construct's primary consciousness, was a human child. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the facility's organic systems seemed to pause, as if reality itself was holding its breath. Then, Sergeant Chin screamed. It wasn't a human sound. It was something primal, something that reached back to whatever dark corner of evolution had taught his species that some things were worth dying for. The sound echoed through the chamber, and I watched 12,000 prisoners hear it and understand exactly what they were seeing. The humans didn't just get angry. They transcended anger entirely. "You made a mistake," Colonel Martinez said, her voice so quiet it somehow carried more menace than Chen's scream. "You could have tortured us, killed us, conquered our worlds. We would have fought you, but we would have understood it. It's what enemies do." She stepped forward, and I noticed that every human in the chamber was moving with her, their individual actions becoming part of some greater pattern I couldn't comprehend. "But you touched our children." The construct seemed to recognize that something fundamental had shifted. The psychological profiles indicate that human attachment to offspring is merely an evolutionary shut up. The words came from every human simultaneously, spoken with such unified purpose that they seemed to carry physical force. What happened next changed my understanding of warfare forever. The humans didn't attack the construct. They didn't attempt to destroy the facility's systems or rescue the prisoners in any conventional sense. Instead, they did something that no military academy in the galaxy had prepared me for. They declared war on the concept of despair itself. Colonel Martinez reached in her kit and pulled out a small device I'd never seen before, a personal holoprojector, similar to the one Shin carried. But instead of displaying a single image, it began to broadcast thousands of them. Pictures of human children, videos of graduation ceremonies, birthday parties, first steps, bedtime stories. Images of human families from every world in the coalition, going about the simple business of living, loving, hoping for the future. "This is what you're really fighting," Martinez announced, her voice carrying through the facility's compromised nervous system to reach every prisoner in every chamber. "Not our weapons, or our ships, or our strategies. This, the simple human belief that tomorrow can be better than today." Other humans began to join the broadcast, adding their own images and memories. The facility's organic walls began to pulse with increasing agitation as the network designed to carry despair was flooded with hope, love, and the indomitable human conviction that some things were worth any sacrifice. The construct recoiled as if physically struck. Impossible. The neural pathways cannot process these emotional matrices. The system was not designed. "That's your problem," Dr. Kim interrupted, her scientific mind analyzing what she was seeing with deadly precision. "You built this thing to understand and exploit the worst of sentient nature. But you never studied what happens when people fight for the best of it." The biomechanical network began to convulse. The construct had been designed to process fear, hatred, despair, all the negative emotions that could be harvested and weaponized. But the humans were flooding it with something else entirely: pure, unconditional love for their species and their future. And the network was overloading. "The prisoners," Chen gasped, pointing toward the pods. "The neural feedback, it's working in reverse." He was right. The same connections the Devourers had used to drain hope from their captives were now carrying it back to them. Throughout the chamber, the pods began to crack and split as the prisoners inside awakened, not to despair, but to something far more dangerous to the Devourer cause. They awakened to purpose. Admiral Rebecca Shaw, former commander of the Coalition's Third Fleet, tore free from her biomechanical restraints with a roar that shook the chamber walls. "All units, this is Shaw. I am resuming command of all Coalition forces in this sector." General Throwtack of the Valerie Marine Corps followed, his massive frame crackling with energy as severed neural links sparked and failed. "Marines, to me, we have a facility to secure." One by one, the greatest military minds the Devourers had captured freed themselves and began coordinating the impossible, a simultaneous uprising across the entire facility, led by commanders who had been given front-row seats to the enemy's plans and capabilities. But it was the child who broke the construct entirely. The little girl in the central pod couldn't have been more than 10 years old. When the biomechanical restraints released her, she stood on unsteady legs and looked around the chamber with eyes that held far too much knowledge for someone so young. "Mama," she called out, her voice carrying through the facility systems. "Mama, are you there? They said you weren't coming, but I knew you would. I knew you'd find me." Somewhere in the facility, a woman's voice answered, raw with emotion and impossible hope. "Emma, Emma, I'm here. Mama's here." I looked at Sergeant Chun and saw tears streaming down his face as he touched his chest pocket. The image of his daughter. The same name. The construct made one final attempt to reassert control. "The child is the key," it announced, energy building around the central pod. "Destroy the offspring, and the human resistance collapses." All psychological models confirm. Every human in the chamber looked at the construct with the same expression I'd seen them wear during the drop. That terrible smile that spoke of dances with death and promises kept at any cost. "You still don't understand," Colonel Martinez said, walking directly toward the construct despite the lethal energy crackling around it. "You think we fight because we have something to lose. But that's not what makes us dangerous." She gestured toward the child, toward the reuniting families throughout the facility, toward the images of human love still broadcasting through the compromised network. "We're dangerous because we have something to protect." The construct fired. The energy beam that lashed out could have disintegrated a starship. It struck Colonel Martinez directly in the chest, and for a moment I thought we'd lost her. Then the smoke cleared, and she was still standing. "Impossible." The construct pulsed with confusion. The energy discharge was sufficient to kill one person, sure, Martinez agreed. But I'm not just one person anymore. I looked around and realized what she meant. Every human in the chamber had moved to shield her, creating a living wall of bodies and energy fields that had absorbed and distributed the blast. Some were wounded, a few were dying, but they were all still fighting. And they were still singing. That's the secret, Chin said, supporting a wounded comrade while maintaining perfect firing position on the construct. We're not individuals who happen to fight together. We're a family that happens to be at war. The construct systems began to fail as the facility's compromised network flooded it with incompatible data. Love instead of hate, hope instead of despair, unity instead of division. Alarms screamed throughout the chamber as biomechanical components began to shut down in cascade failure. Primary containment failing. Admiral Shaw reported from her position near the wall displays. The network collapse is spreading to other Devourer installations across the sector. They're losing their coordination. It was true. The construct had been more than just a processing center. It had been a command node connected to similar facilities throughout Devourer space. As it died, poisoned by human hope, it was taking their entire strategic network with it. We did it, someone whispered. We actually did it. But the humans weren't finished. As the construct's death throes shook the facility, Colonel Martinez gathered her people around her. Listen to me, she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the chamber. We've won this battle, but the war isn't over. There are other facilities, other prisoners, other children who need us to come for them. She looked directly at me, and I saw in her eyes the weight of command, the burden of leadership, and something else, the terrible knowledge of what her species was capable of when pushed beyond its limits. The Devourers wanted to understand what makes humans fight, she continued. They thought if they could break our spirit, they could break our resistance. But they made one fundamental error in their calculations. The construct gave one final pulse of energy and died, its biomechanical components dissolving into organic waste. Around us, the facility's systems began a controlled shutdown as the released prisoners worked to ensure no evidence of Devourer research was lost. What error? I found myself asking. Martinez smiled. Not the terrible smile of a predator, but the warm expression of someone who had found exactly what she'd been looking for in the darkness. They assumed we were fighting because we were afraid of losing what we loved, she said. But the truth is, we were fighting because we were afraid of not being worthy of what loves us back. In the distance, I could hear the sound of rescue ships entering the system, their engines singing the hymn of hope fulfilled. Coalition reinforcements were arriving, drawn by the facility's beacon and the incredible story that would soon spread across the galaxy. The story of 12,000 prisoners who had refused to be broken, led by a species that turned love into a weapon and hope into an unstoppable force. As we began the process of evacuation and evidence gathering, I found myself walking beside Sergeant Shun. His daughter, the real Emma, not just the holographic image, ran ahead of us, her hand clasped firmly in his as they headed toward the landing bays and the promise of home. Commander, Chun said quietly, earlier you asked what drives a human to war. I think you understand now. I did. But understanding and accepting were different things. Your species terrifies me, I admitted. The things you're capable of, the lengths you'll go to protect what you love. It defies every principle of rational warfare. Shin nodded thoughtfully. Good, he said simply, because we're not fighting a rational enemy. We're fighting an existential one. And sometimes the only answer to existential threat is existential commitment. As we boarded the rescue ships and prepared to leave this place of nightmares behind, I realized that I had witnessed something unprecedented in galactic history. Not just a military victory, but a fundamental shift in the balance of power. The Devourers had spent centuries studying the species of the Coalition, learning to exploit their weaknesses and fears. They had built an empire on the principle that all sentient life could be broken harvested, and consumed. Then, they had encountered humanity, and humanity had taught them that some things in the universe are stronger than fear, more enduring than despair, and more dangerous than any weapon ever forged. They had learned that gods might create the universe, but humans would fight to make sure it was worth living in. The last transport lifted off from the facility's ruins as demolition charges reduced the nightmare to ash and memory. But the real victory wasn't in the destruction of one installation or the rescue of 12,000 prisoners. The real victory was in the message now spreading across Devourer space through their compromised communications network, a message broadcast in the voices of human children, carried by the love of human families, and backed by the absolute conviction of species that had looked into the abyss and decided to redecorate. The message was simple. We're coming for the rest of them. All of them. And nothing in this universe or any other will stop us. As our ships entered hyperspace, carrying us toward the next battle in a war that suddenly seemed winnable, I understood at last why the ancient legends spoke of gods fearing mortal fury. Because mortality meant that every moment mattered. Every love was precious. Every sacrifice was sacred. And when you threatened what mortals held sacred, you didn't face an army. You faced a force of nature wearing human faces and singing impossible songs. 3 months after the Kepler 442 incident, the war changed. Not gradually, as military conflicts usually evolve, but with the sudden, decisive shift of a universe finally understanding what it was truly fighting. The rescue mission that was supposed to be a footnote in coalition military records became the spark that ignited something the Devourers had never encountered in their 1,000-year reign of terror. They faced an enemy that refused to be afraid. I stood in the war room of the coalition dreadnought Harmony's voice, watching tactical displays that showed the impossible becoming routine. Human-led task forces were striking Devourer installations across 3 sectors simultaneously. Rescue operations that should have taken months were being completed in days. Facilities that had stood unconquered for decades were falling to forces that seemed to operate on principles that transcended conventional military science. Commander Zithkara, Admiral Shaw's voice drew my attention from the displays. The former coalition prisoner had been promoted to overall strategic command, her first-hand knowledge of Devourer capabilities making her invaluable to the war effort. We're ready for the briefing. The assembled commanders represented the finest military minds from a dozen species. Valerian strategists whose tactical programs had won 100 battles. Zephyrian coordinators whose hive mind calculations could process millions of variables. Aquari intelligence specialists whose intuitive grasp of enemy psychology was legendary. And humans. Always humans with their quiet confidence and that unsettling tendency to smile when everyone else was calculating acceptable losses. Intelligence indicates the Devourers are consolidating their forces, Admiral Shaw began, activating a holographic display that showed the current state of the war. They're abandoning their outer territories and pulling back to heavily fortified core systems. Classic defensive strategy when facing superior numbers. But we don't have superior numbers, pointed out General Kithara, her Valerian tactical implants processing the data with mechanical precision. Our latest estimates put Devourer forces at nearly 3 times coalition strength. Numbers aren't everything, Colonel Martinez interjected. She'd been promoted after Kepler 442, but she still wore the same expression I'd learned to associate with impossible human plans. They're consolidating because they're afraid. And afraid enemies make mistakes. Afraid? General Throwtack's massive frame rumbled with skepticism. The Devourers have conquered half the galaxy. What could possibly make them afraid of us? I found myself speaking before I'd fully formed the thought. They're afraid because they finally understand what they're fighting. The room fell silent. 20 of the galaxy's most experienced military commanders looked at me with expressions ranging from curiosity to confusion. Explain, Admiral Shaw requested. I called up my own tactical display, showing the pattern of human operations over the past 3 months. Look at the targeting priorities. The Devourers expected us to go after strategic installations, shipyards, command centers, supply depots. Instead, the humans consistently prioritize prisoner processing facilities. Of course they do, General Kithara observed. It's what we'd expect from her psychological profile. Humans are emotionally driven, no. My interruption surprised everyone, including myself. You're thinking like a conventional strategist. The humans aren't rescuing prisoners because they're emotional. They're doing it because they understand something we don't. I manipulated the display to show the cascade effects of each rescue operation. Every facility we hit doesn't just free prisoners. It sends a message through the Devourer network. That message isn't surrender or die. It's something far more terrifying to a species that feeds on despair. Colonel Martinez was smiling that dangerous smile again. Tell them, Commander. What's the message? The message is, nobody is forgotten. Nobody is abandoned. We will come for every last one of you, no matter how long it takes, no matter what it costs. I looked around the room, seeing comprehension dawn on alien faces. The Devourers built their empire on the principle that resistance is futile, that eventually everyone breaks, that hope is just delayed despair. The humans are proving them wrong, one rescue at a time. Admiral Shaw nodded slowly. And now they're consolidating because scattered forces are vulnerable to the kind of precision strikes we've been conducting. They're trying to create strongholds too powerful for us to crack. Which brings us to the real briefing, Colonel Martinez said. Her tone had shifted, becoming the voice of command that had carried 12,000 prisoners out of hell. Intelligence has located the primary Devourer command facility, the installation where they coordinate their entire galactic strategy. The holographic display shifted, showing a system so heavily fortified it looked more like a geometric theorem than a military installation. Overlapping defense grids, automated weapon platforms, and a space fleet that could have conquered most coalition worlds single-handedly. The Nexus, Admiral Shaw breathed. We've been looking for this place for 50 years. It's more than a command center, Dr. Kim's voice carried scientific excitement, mixed with deep concern. According to the intelligence we recovered from Kepler 442, it's where they conduct their primary research on breaking the will of conquered species. If we can take it, we can end this war, General Throwtack finished. But the defenses, the casualties would be enormous. Even with our full fleet, we'd lose 60% of our force's minimum. I studied the tactical projection, running calculations that made my combat computer generate warnings about mission survivability. Every conventional analysis suggested the same conclusion. Attacking the Nexus would be suicide. The humans looked at it and began planning their assault. What are you thinking? I asked Colonel Martinez. I'm thinking about a conversation I had with my daughter before I left for this war, she replied. She asked me why I had to go fight the bad guys. I told her it was because someone has to stand between the darkness and the light. She gestured toward the holographic fortress. That's where they've been keeping the darkness, Commander. Time to let some light in. The planning session that followed challenged every principle of military strategy I'd ever learned. Where conventional doctrine called for overwhelming force and acceptable losses, the humans proposed something that sounded more like performance art than warfare. We don't attack the defenses, Sergeant Chen explained, his tactical display showing movement patterns that defied standard formation logic. We attack what the defenses are protecting. The Nexus itself is impregnable, Dr. Kim added, her xenobiological expertise lending scientific credence to the impossible plan. But it's also a biomechanical construct that depends on psychological energy, specifically the despair and fear of billions of conquered beings, to function. So we give it indigestion, Colonel Martinez concluded with that terrifying smile. The plan they proposed was simultaneously elegant and insane. Instead of bringing an invasion fleet, they wanted to bring prisoners. Not as captives, but as volunteers. Every person they'd rescued from Devourer facilities over the past 3 months returned to face their captors one final time. It won't work, General Kithara insisted. Traumatized prisoners cannot be effective combat personnel. The psychological damage alone is exactly why it will work, Dr. Kim interrupted. The Nexus feeds on despair, but despair transformed becomes something else entirely. These people aren't broken, they're forged, tempered by experience into something the Devourers never expected to face. I found myself thinking of the singing in the facility corridors, of 12,000 voices raised in defiance of despair itself. You're not planning to conquer the Nexus, I realized. You're planning to convert it. Every person they try to break becomes a living contradiction to their basic philosophy, Colonel Martinez confirmed. Every survivor who stands up and fights back proves that their central assumption, that hope is finite and despair is eternal, is wrong. The assembled commanders spent the next 6 hours in heated debate. The Valorians argued from tactical doctrine. The Zephyrians ran probability calculations. The Aquari consulted their intuitive understanding of group psychology. The humans listened politely, then announced they were going anyway. With or without official sanction, Admiral Shaw said firmly, "This is what humans do. We see someone in a cage, we break them out. We see someone building cages, we stop them. The Nexus isn't just a military installation. It's a monument to the idea that sentient beings can be reduced to resources to be harvested. That ends now." 2 weeks later, I stood on the bridge of a ship that shouldn't have existed, watching an armada that defied every principle of military logic approach the most heavily defended position in known space. The Liberation was a converted transport vessel, its cargo bays filled not with weapons or supplies, but with volunteers. Thousands of former prisoners who had chosen to return to the source of their nightmares, armed with nothing more than standard infantry equipment, and the absolute conviction that some things were worth dying for. Around us, 100 similar ships maintained formation, each one carrying survivors who had looked into hell and decided to redecorate. They came from every species, every world, every corner of the galaxy where the Devourers had planted their flag of despair. And they were singing, not the human song this time, but something new, a harmony that transcended species barriers, a melody that spoke of shared suffering transformed into shared strength. It carried through space itself, reaching the Nexus long before our ships entered weapons range. Devourer Defense Fleet is responding, Lieutenant Yerix reported from the tactical station. 300 vessels, all primary combat configurations. They're moving to intercept. Through the viewports, I could see them, sleek predatory shapes that had terrorized the galaxy for centuries, their biomechanical hulls pulsing with malevolent life. Each one was a masterwork of destructive engineering, capable of reducing coalition dreadnoughts to floating debris. The volunteer fleet didn't even slow down. All ships, this is Admiral Shaw. Her voice carried across every channel. Remember, we're not here to win a battle. We're here to end a war. Every shot you don't fire is a prisoner we might save. Every enemy you don't destroy is a being who might still remember what it means to hope. The Devourer fleet opened fire first, their weapons tearing through space with lethal precision. Energy beams that could punch through planetary shields struck the volunteer ships with devastating effect and bounced harmlessly off their hulls. "Impossible," General Throwtack breathed. "Those are standard transport vessels. They don't have that kind of shielding." Dr. Kim was studying her scanner readings with scientific fascination. "They don't have any shielding at all," she reported. "The energy weapons are being absorbed and dispersed by something else entirely." I looked at the volunteers crowded into our cargo bay, still singing their impossible song, and understood. "It's not the ships," I said quietly. "It's the people. They're not just absorbing the weapon's fire. They're transforming it. The Devourer weapons were designed to feed on fear, to convert terror into destructive force. But the volunteers had transcended fear. Their collective will, their shared determination, their absolute refusal to be afraid was somehow converting the enemy's own weapons into protective energy. "All ships, advance to Phase 2, Admiral Shaw ordered. What followed challenged the fundamental laws of physics, psychology, and military science simultaneously. The volunteer fleet didn't return fire. Instead, they began broadcasting, not tactical communications or surrender demands, but personal messages. Stories of survival, testimonies of hope, promises kept, and promises made. The effect on the Devourer fleet was immediate and catastrophic. Their formation is breaking up, tactical reported. Individual ships are dropping out of combat formation. Some are powering down weapons systems entirely. Through the chaos of battle, I could see Devourer vessels actually retreating, not from superior firepower, but from something they had never encountered before. They were retreating from hope itself. The Nexus is responding, Dr. Kim announced. It's activating some kind of emergency protocol. The massive space station ahead of us began to pulse with dark energy, its biomechanical components writhing with increasing agitation. Weapon emplacements that could have destroyed continents swiveled to target the approaching volunteer fleet. The volunteers sang louder. "This is it," Colonel Martinez announced over the ship-wide communication system. "Everyone who has ever been told they were broken, everyone who has ever been told to give up, everyone who has ever been told that hope is just delayed despair. This is our answer." The Nexus fired. The energy discharge was beyond anything I'd ever witnessed, a weapon designed not just to destroy matter, but to obliterate the very concept of resistance. It should have erased the volunteer fleet from existence, leaving nothing but cosmic dust and the memory of a failed idealism. Instead, it fed the song. The volunteers absorbed the energy, transformed it, and sent it back as something the Nexus had never experienced, pure, unconditional love for the future they were fighting to create. The space station convulsed as incompatible energy flooded its biomechanical systems. Alarms echoed across space as defense grids shut down in cascade failure. The dark pulsing that had marked it as a source of galactic despair flickered and died. "All teams, commence boarding operations," Admiral Shaw ordered. What followed was less an invasion than a reunion. Throughout the Nexus, prisoners held in processing facilities for decades began breaking free as their bonds, powered by despair, failed in the presence of hope. Automated systems designed to crush the spirit malfunctioned when confronted with spirits that refused to be crushed. I followed Colonel Martinez through corridors that pulsed with dying bioluminescence, watching as volunteers worked to shut down torture chambers, processing centers, and the vast computational matrices that had coordinated galactic-scale atrocities. "The Central Command Chamber is ahead," Sergeant Shin reported. "Massive biomechanical construct, similar to what we found on Kepler, 442, but orders of magnitude larger. We found it in the heart of the station, a nightmare fusion of technology and biology that stretched for kilometers in every direction. But, unlike its smaller cousin, this construct wasn't trying to fight us. It was trying to understand us." Fascinating, the voice echoed from everywhere, and nowhere carried through organic neural networks that had processed the suffering of billions. "Your species presents an unprecedented paradox. The more trauma you experience, the stronger your resistance becomes. The more you lose, the more fiercely you fight to protect what remains." Colonel Martinez stepped forward, small and fragile in the shadow of the vast intelligence that had orchestrated centuries of galactic horror. "You're not the first bully who couldn't understand why their victims eventually fought back." "Bully," the construct pulsed with confusion. "We are the apex of biological and technological evolution. We are efficiency incarnate. We process inefficiency into useful resources. You process people, and your resistance should have been eliminated by our psychological conditioning protocols," it insisted. "The mathematical certainty of despair should have overcome your irrational attachment to hope." "Math doesn't account for love," Dr. Kim observed, studying the readouts from her scanners. "You can calculate the odds of survival, but you can't quantify what someone is willing to sacrifice for their children. You can process the efficiency of fear, but you can't measure the power of someone deciding that they've had enough. The construct fell silent for a long moment. When it spoke again, its voice carried something I'd never heard from a devourer intelligence before. Uncertainty. If we are wrong, if hope is not merely delayed despair, then our entire civilization is based on a false premise. Colonel Martinez nodded. Welcome to the beginning of wisdom. The first step is admitting you might be wrong about the fundamental nature of existence. But if we are wrong, the construct continued, its biomechanical components pulsing with increasing agitation. Then, the beings we have processed, the civilizations we have consumed, the centuries of imposed despair, were crimes, Admiral Shaw said firmly. But crimes can be answered for. Damage can be repaired. The galaxy can be rebuilt. What happened next would be remembered as the moment the war truly ended. The construct didn't self-destruct as we'd expected. Instead, it began to transform. Biomechanical components that had been designed to process suffering reorganized themselves into communication networks. Data cores filled with the accumulated despair of conquered worlds began transmitting something else entirely. Messages of hope, coordinates of hidden prisoner facilities, and, most importantly, detailed plans for reversing the biological corruption the Devourers had spread across the galaxy. It's learning, Dr. Kim whispered in amazement. The entire Devourer collective consciousness is rewriting itself based on the evidence we've provided. Throughout space, Devourer installations began powering down. Ships that had terrorized the galaxy for centuries transmitted surrender codes. Processing facilities opened their doors and released prisoners who had given up hope of ever seeing freedom again. The transformation wasn't instant or universal. Some Devourer remnants would continue to resist the change, requiring years of careful work to convince or contain. But the war itself, the existential threat that had hung over the galaxy for a millennium, was ending not with the destruction of an enemy, but with their conversion to a new understanding of what it meant to exist. As we prepared to leave the Nexus, now transforming from a monument to despair into a beacon of rehabilitation, I found myself walking beside Sergeant Chun once again. He was holding his daughter's hologram, but this time he wasn't alone. The real Emma walked beside him, rescued from a processing facility 3 sectors away by a volunteer team that had refused to accept that any child was irretrievably lost. Commander, Chun said as we approached the transport docks, I want to thank you. For what? I asked, genuinely puzzled. For seeing us, he replied simply. For watching what we did and understanding that it wasn't madness or desperation. For recognizing that love can be a weapon more powerful than any technology. I looked back at the Nexus, now pulsing with bioluminescence that spoke of healing rather than horror, surrounded by volunteer ships that sang songs of hope into the cosmic dark. I think you have that backwards, Sergeant. You taught me to see what warfare could become when it's driven not by hate or conquest, but by the simple desire to make sure everyone gets to go home. Emma looked up at me with curious eyes. Are you coming home with us, Mr. Commander? The question caught me off guard. Home, for a Valerian warrior, had always been the next battlefield, the next mission, the next opportunity to prove strength against weakness. But as I watched families reuniting across species barriers, as former enemies worked together to heal wounds that had festered for centuries, as the galaxy itself began to transform from a place of endless conflict into something that might actually be worth the fighting, I realized that home might be something different entirely. Yes, I told her. I think I am. The journey back to Coalition space took 3 weeks, but it felt like the first 3 weeks of a new age. The volunteers had become something more than rescued prisoners. They were the founding members of a new galactic community, one based not on the assumption that conflict was inevitable, but on the revolutionary idea that it was solvable. As our ships entered the Sol system, humanity's home, which had become the unofficial capital of the New Order, I stood on the observation deck and watched Earth turn slowly in its ancient dance around a familiar star. Beautiful, isn't it? Colonel Martinez joined me at the viewport. I still don't understand how you do it, I admitted. How you can look at impossible odds and see opportunity. How you can face existential threats and respond with love instead of fear. She smiled. Not the dangerous smile of a predator, but the warm expression of someone who had found exactly what she'd been looking for in the darkness. It's not complicated, Commander. We just remember that the universe is very large and very dark, but it's also full of people who are worth turning on a light for. In the cargo bay behind us, thousands of voices were singing again. Not songs of war or sorrow, but lullabies and love songs and the simple melodies that every species uses to teach their children that tomorrow will come, and it will be better than today. And somewhere in that harmony, I finally understood why gods might fear their fury. Not because humans were destroyers, but because they were builders. Not because they brought endings, but because they insisted on beginnings. Not because they conquered darkness, but because they refused to accept that darkness was unconquerable. They were the species that looked at a universe full of horrors and said, "We can fix this." And then they did.